Literally, my.
That's one.
Your
Yeah.
You got Joe.
I don't know.
I've only had a smoothie. Yeah, like shaking and need some lunch. This is the you have a music after.
Yeah.
So Dennis sort of sounds like
Of course. Yep.
and I told him it was trial.
We're waiting for
Video.
Oh, right.
All right.
Yeah, that's the camera up there.
I didn't know where it finished. He said it jumped well.
Gary's in charge. Gary's in charge of technology, aren't you?
Unfortunately.
Okay, team. I think we're ready. I think we're ready to get cracking. I will pass over to Gary and Caroline. Revenue and finance policy.
Thank you. This should be a little bit of light lifting for you this afternoon after a pretty full-on day by the looks of things. Just before I get started, I just want to point out I've got Beth Harker here as well, who is one of our rates specialists. And so with the work that we'll be kicking off after this workshop today, Beth will be doing a lot of work in the background around the rates modelling. So she actually does quite a bit of work in this space. So it's just nice to sort of point her out today. So the purpose of this workshop, and it shouldn't be a very long one, is really just to revisit for a lot of the councillors, although for some it's visiting, the revenue and financing policy and what it is, and to discuss what's required for a review as well. And we'll just cover off on some of the, yeah, I'll sort that out. We'll cover off on some of the items that were flagged from the last review we did, as well as just get you thinking a little bit about some of the things we may need to highlight this time around as well. And finally, we'll just look at the timeline for the review itself. So, question is, what triggered this review? Well, back in May 2024, during the deliberations for the 3-year plan, this was the instructions or the direction to officers. So this was in response to some of the stormwater stuff and some of the wider issues around the rating structure itself. Now, what's quite important to highlight as well is that throughout the last review, there was always the expectation from council that we would revisit elements of our rating system anyway. And so it was something that was already on the cards, but it just sort of further prompted us to say, okay, well, we do need to get started on this. So big question a lot of people may have is, what is the revenue and financing policy? So it's a foundational policy, and there are so many other policies and parts of council that rely on it. So it details the activities that council performs, the funding sources that we use, and how they're going to be applied against those activities. And so if we look to change one small part of it, can actually have an impact on other parts of our policy or how we conduct things at council. And so you can rarely just look at one thing in isolation. It's not a vacuum, unfortunately. One thing impacts another, and it's, yeah. So in terms of the review itself, especially with the reimagining project underway, council needs to review the activities it engages in and how they consider them, how they need to be funded. So the structure itself and how it contributes to activities is only part of the story. So consideration also needs to be given to the sources, such as financial contributions, fees and charges, lending, the proceeds of asset sales, all these sorts of things. And so for those of you that are here for the last review, you'll recall that over a number of workshops, that was dedicated to the analysis of the activities and with regards to sort of the impact on the community and how they engage with those activities. So in essence, we were creating a link between engaging in the activity itself and why particular funding mechanisms were used to support it, and how it benefits community as well. It can sound a little bit fluffy, but it's actually quite a methodical process to go through. There's a lot of debate and discussion that went on in doing that. And I think that's something that's probably important to flag for the public as well, as these aren't decisions that are taken lightly. There's actually a lot of work that you guys do around this to build this structure. So, and yeah, what's quite important about going through this work as well is it tells a complete story of, of Napier City Council and what it does. Council activities. So a lot of this is driven by legislation, which is sort of referenced Section 101 of the Local Government Act. And within it, it just says, it discusses funding needs of local authority must be met from those sources that local authority determines to be appropriate following consideration of and in relation to. And so it'll talk about things such as community outcomes, the groups or individuals who benefit from it, the period of those benefits as well, and exacerbators to the process or those activities. What if we don't fund those activities or we don't have those activities? What is the impact? So it's also looking at the negative aspects of those things, and also the cost of the benefit of that activity to the public. So there's a lot of things that need to be balanced within that. And so, especially when you look towards the back of the revenue and financing policy, I mean, all this stuff that is there in table form. I don't know how many people get through it. It's about 34 pages of information. It's quite large, but these are the things that we'll be looking at and discussing in future workshops as well. So, a few of the things that were flagged. One of them was a rural residential differential. So in our original discussion around this, and part of the reason it was included was as a transitional step for properties that were moving from rural potentially to residential. So some of the issues that ratepayers face, and it was acknowledged by council, and we did put steps in place to mitigate or to reduce the impact on them, was to either create steps within the rating. So, for instance, rather than going from 60% up to 100% of the rating, normal rating base, they would go from 60 to 90%, and then we then agreed to do it over a 3-year period to reduce that impact. But when the rural residential differential was created, it was looked at as just a temporary measure within that, and something we would have to address again. Something else that we also looked at was the capital value approach. And part of the decision around not looking at it within the last review was it would have been such a significant impact on ratepayers. So we're one of the last councils in the country that still uses land value for our general rates. And so what that means is that, we don't look at any of the capital improvements on the property. It's just purely what the value of the land is itself. And so it doesn't matter whether you've got, a small property with a modest house on it, or a small property with a fancy house. They'll both still have the same general rate applied to them. And so with capital value, what it does is instead of looking purely at the land value, it looks at the overall improved value of the property. And in the sort of rating space, we do look at it as a great leveler. So you could have a farm with a modest house on it, and it may have the same capital value as a smaller property with a large commercial building on it. And so it helps to even things out. And so when it comes to issues such as rural residential differentials, it may reduce the need to worry about those sorts of things. And so these are a couple of points that we will look at as part of this review. So this is where I'll be sort of looking to you as well for a little bit of direction about some of the other things that we need to consider. So obviously one of the big ones that we'll be concerned with is Three Waters and what's happening there. So we can't predict what the final outcome of that's going to be, but we can sort of take some steps to recognise it within our revenue and financing policy. So you don't need to answer it right now, but these are just some of the things that I'd like to think about, because we'll have workshops coming up soon where we will need to start discussing this in a little bit more detail.
A little bit in there. So this also could be quite a good opportunity for us to think about, are there any additional targeted rates that you might want to introduce, and one might be, for example, an economic development rate. It could cover funding for tourism, the likes of Hawke's Bay Tourism, the funding that we've had to find, Matariki and Rita, whatever happens there, plus other tourism activities. So that's just an idea to float out there, but there may be some other targeted rates that you might have an interest in looking into further. So that's really what this part's about.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Will the investment property and portfolio policy be affected by the establishment of the CCTO?
Will it be affected? So the policy itself allows the sale of leasehold land, provided that certain conditions are met. So no, it wouldn't. That policy facilitates the ability to sell down some of that land. The CCTO is just purely going to be a vehicle that makes decisions on what property could be sold, and obviously within the framework the council has set on this.
Slightly different, I think. Now.
Yeah, it's a slightly different issue.
And just another couple of questions, if I may. Affordability is talked about from time to time. Where is the definition? Is that legislated, or is that something that we determine?
It's something that we can, there are government figures available. It's not something that's actually defined because it is a difficult one to do so. But typically around affordability, there will be certain metrics in place, and they even differ from country to country, but in New Zealand, it'll be things such as being able to purchase, basic staple items. It'll be actually things such as whether you can afford to have a TV and those sorts of things as well, which form that kind of general viewpoint, but there's no sort of line drawn in the sand around that. And it's something, actually, it's a good point, because I do recall several years ago when we originally did that emergency flood remission, we were looking at the definition of affordability and we came across the same issue with that. Yeah.
We applied a formula. Yeah.
No, we didn't have a formula as such,
Yeah,
but what we did is,
Yeah, we did.
Is that 2.5% of income or something?
So I think there's some stuff in code.
Yeah.
yeah,
Some of them are a bit of a nonsense, because it's almost, there's the other one, which is around setting up rates cap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We always just set that to fit in with whatever our rate increase is.
so,
Affordability is a little bit the same when we do some comparisons around like household income and how that should fit into the income.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any hard and fast ratio.
that's right.
But I know we rationalised our decision based on,
A guide.
yeah.
There's guides, but there's no rules.
Yeah,
So it's generally going by feel, and so we do set our own, but it's some of it can be difficult to measure in terms of affordability as well. So, but when it comes to the CCTO's work, that will be a vehicle that helps enable council to generate additional revenue, and that the activity it does would feed back into the considerations of the revenue and financing policy as well. So, because they don't own the assets as such. I mean, it's still owned by council. They're just helping to realise the activities of council. Yeah.
Thank you, that's it.
So essentially what you're needing from us today is just an initial conversation around the scope of what the review will cover.
That's right. I'm just letting you know what's coming.
Yeah.
So that's why I said it's a little bit of light lifting for you today, but just to inform you of what we will be looking at, because this is actually, it's a long process. And so now what we're looking at is the next long-term plan. That's our target, to have everything finished and adopted by then. Sorry, you've got a question?
In terms of the previous slide around what other things to consider, it would be good to get a reminder of, remember at our long-term plan, there was the whole conversation around stormwater, particularly up in Bayview. And there was some sort of equity issues around people being required to deal with all their stormwater on site and then being charged a targeted rate. It'd be good to get a bit of a refresh on what happened there and if we need to make any changes in that space.
Of course. Well, that will certainly form part of the discussion. And part of the reason being is that stormwater is one of the part of the activity that council funds. And so it'll need to be part of the consideration. And so that's where the discussion will come into it. It's something we'll certainly flag. Yeah.
Through you, Mayor Wise. Thank you, Gary. Just in regards to what other issues do we need to consider? And please let me know if some of my thinking is off track, because it's not part of, I was trying to get my head around looking at that model around rating policies and all the interactions back into this, so whether or not they're in and out of scope. So the kinds of things I was hoping that we could, as part of this review, have a look at was targeted rates for tourism infrastructure. Obviously, we've got pressure back on ourselves to fund that activity, and I think if we're undertaking this review, it's an appropriate time to look at how we do that. The second thing I wanted to raise in terms of scope was rating on vacant land. So we're having all of this national direction around enabling development. I know that we don't have a whole lot of vacant land, but I think nationally you've seen some councils roll out higher rates for land where people are choosing not to develop. And I think that's something we could potentially look at.
Yeah, absolutely. These are definitely issues that we can look at. So within the revenue and financing policy itself, it talks generally about the ability to use targeted rates. It doesn't specify what they are, and it's up to the discretion of council to establish that. But when we're looking at this overall system, one of what the activities are, how we need to fund it, then that's when those discussions around what form should the rates take come into it. And so these are absolutely points that would need to cover off as part of that. So cool. Yes, this is really helpful. Thank you.
Through you, Mayor Wise, I have two more. The first is, of those two, is rates flexibility for, I'm thinking of startup businesses. So we have some vacant CBD properties. I've seen other councils use incentives in their rating system to incentivise new business startup. And I wonder if that is something we could look at for our commercial zones.
Just thinking.
Just throwing grenades at you, and then
No,
you get
these
time
aren't
to
grenades.
think
These are
about them.
ideas.
Don't need an answer right now.
No, no.
Put it on your radar.
And my last one is green buildings. So incentivising environmental sustainability in the way people start with or retrofit their buildings to be more sustainable. So those are my 4 areas for potential.
Okay.
Thank you.
I can provide a couple of quick, sorry.
All right, another one for you, Mayor Wise. Discussion on the resilience rate and what that could be used for. Or should be used.
So what we have at the moment, I will work backwards through a couple of these if that's okay. So with the resilience rate at the moment, we've defined it generally to provide flexibility there in how it is used, provided it is used for that resilience activity. And so you can absolutely further define it if you want. I would be careful though in tightening it down too much, just to make sure that, there's a law of unintended consequences of when you over-define something, that it may restrict it too much that you can't use it for some of the other things that might actually be good for, that we haven't thought of at the time. But yes, absolutely. But discussion around those projects is a good idea.
Yeah.
And working backwards as well. So with green buildings, there are some incentives by a number of banks around providing cheaper funding for green builds, but that is certainly something we could look at now that we've got a specialist in who is working around measuring our carbon footprint and helping with the sort of the more green projects at council, especially building, that sort of thing. It would make it easier for us to provide some assessment on that. And we're going through the process ourselves, and so we're getting a better understanding what is required there. So that's certainly something we could do.
Yeah, just to add to that, I imagine we'd be linked to some sort of external as well in terms of green building certifications that I know.
That's right. There's there are bodies out that do the certification. They provide very clear guidelines on that. When it comes to startup businesses, this may be something that's more along the grant funding path, but something that certainly can be discussed in terms of in terms of the activities of council as well. So, but with regards to say rates, normally because we're rating on property, startups don't usually own their own property, so we couldn't look at it on that basis. But with the activities that council does engage in, that is something you certainly discuss. So
Yeah,
wider discussion.
I think it would be good to look at some of the things that I've seen is that obviously those startups face those part of their rates as part of their initial setup cost to taking out a lease. And so if you were to incentivise landlords in terms of rates for remissions for, say, a sliding scale of a couple of years when leasing to new businesses, it would potentially have a direct flow-on effect.
Okay.
Max?
Yes, I've got a couple. One is looking at rating on capital value versus land, which you did mention, and I think it would be worth, it's obviously a long discussion, but it would be, I think it's worth looking at. As you said, that most councils use that. And the other one, I'm not quite sure what Deputy Mayor's, if it is covered by that, but I just wondered about Airbnbs, if there are councils who have special rates for Airbnbs.
That is one I would avoid if we can.
The one you what?
It's been a minefield for
It's been a
Auckland.
real minefield.
Yeah, they've had numerous court cases over it as well, and it's a very difficult one to police. It's almost like whack-a-mole because an Airbnb can pop up and disappear again quite quickly. I can understand it from the hoteliers and the motel owners' perspective because they've got a permanent business, and so it can seem quite unfair on them. But it is very difficult to regulate on a rating basis. Yeah.
The difficulty is how do you classify a short stay accommodation provider? Yeah.
Yeah, is there any, has there ever been any thought put into long-term unoccupied houses having a higher rating than houses that are being lived in, just to that housing shortage? If there's, say, a house that's been empty for 5 or 10 years, we could charge more?
Potentially. So when it comes to, say, land banking, that's an easier one to identify because you can see that there's a house not there or there's a building not there. When it comes to unoccupied buildings, it's not always clear whether they are or aren't occupied, provided the rates are still being paid. And that can be quite difficult to police as well. So we've looked at a few proposals in the past around potential ways that we can sort of change the rating system, but the amount of administrative burden is quite high. So that's a tricky one as well. Yeah.
Okay, any further suggestions, comments, questions?
Is development confusion part of this?
No, that's separate, and Paulina and her team have been working on that, and I think there was an indication of still probably quite a couple of year time frame in terms of working through that process, from my memory.
Yeah, because I was thinking again along the lines of the Green Star building, that incentive to housing in the CBD. But that's probably
We have got some incentives in our current revenue and financing policy around incentivising the conversion to residential in our CBD, and that was around the sewer and some of the charges that we were.
That's right.
And we've discounted them, haven't we? And
Yeah.
Yeah, could we do
So I
more?
guess perhaps just a review of that would be quite useful
course.
as well. Because it would still be great to further incentivise those conversions. Yeah,
Neighbours.
Hopefully some RMA and Building Act change might enable
actually
that
help
as
with
well.
that. Because the biggest issue is all the fire side of stuff.
Oh, yeah, that is major.
Yeah, we're quite limited in what we can do.
Yeah, no, yeah, nothing.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So finally, this is just a little bit of a timeline around what we're expecting. So over the next few months, this is where we'll be going through those initial discussions on the activities and the funding and all that sort of thing, before we start to do a little bit of modelling around how this might look. And so it's quite important, not just to discuss it, but also to provide feedback to show this is how it may look as well, to inform you and sort of make further decisions on that. We've got an election in between, so it'll be important to go back and provide a refresh for everybody after that, and just to keep the momentum going. And then by the time we get to February, we'll be looking at having a draft document in front of council for approval or adoption for consultation out to the public, and then we'll go through the normal process of consultation and then final adoption. So we've got a lot to do between now and then. And so this is just to say, brace yourself, please.
Right. Very good.
And that's pretty much all of it for today. Cool.
I think Gary's going to be doing it, aren't you? Are we getting Philip involved like we
You
did
may
last
see
time?
him
Please.
from time to time.
From time to
but
time.
Won't be a permanent fixture.
Yeah, he'll be assisting with some of it.
And it,
Chocolates.
I think there's people that leave properties while they're away on holiday for more than a year should pay more
We
rate.
finished now?
I'll be a submitter.
I was going to suggest that
And run next. Thanks, Tam.